Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Welcome to Learning in Retirement. I want to see each of you reach into your purse or your pocket and get your phone and turn it off. Appreciate your doing that. We're excited about our program today. Carlton Fulford, as you know, is a Pines resident, is a retired four-star Marine Corps general who served as Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the United States European Command, a post which gave him firsthand up-close experience with the National North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Nato. His topic today is NATO and our security. A Georgia native, General Fulford graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy and holds an advanced degree from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He served in the Vietnam War, Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and held commands including a post as commander of the U.S. Fleet Marines in the Pacific. His many decorations include the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and Distinguished Service Medal. One of the very exciting things he has done here at the Pines is organized with Margot Hyde the Veterans Project interviews for the Library of Congress. Carl and his wife, Mary Ann, have two sons, one of whom is also a Marine. He's a Major General, and another who lives in Davidson. So at this point, please welcome Carlton Fulford.
I want to thank you for that kind invitation, and I've got two caveats to begin with. When Irvin Duggan asked me to do this presentation, we had an agreement that if there were any political questions, he would handle that. And then he failed to show up today. So if you have any political questions, save it for Irvin, not for me. And the other thing I want to lay up front is that I'm just a simple soldier. I'm not one of these polished professors that normally teaches here. So keep the bar low, if you will, when we go through this presentation. I am excited, though, to talk to you about NATO. It's in the news now for good reasons, and we need to understand the truth behind it, and that's sort of what I want to talk about is facts, and then leave enough time for you to ask questions, because I'm interested in your questions. I want to know what you want to know about NATO. So I will try to move through this fairly quickly. I'm going to talk about the background and organization and a little bit about potential challenges that I see coming forth. And then I'm anxious to hear what's on your mind and what your questions are. So with that, let's start with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's what NATO stands for. There are some important things about this title. Number one, it is a treaty. It has the full force of law within the United States. It was voted on and passed by 98 senators to nothing in 1949, and the president signed it. So it is a full-fledged treaty agreed upon by the leadership of our nation. Also, the first two words, North Atlantic, normally when you think about NATO, you think about Europe. I think North Atlantic is very important, and it was clearly on the minds of the people that formed this organization. And there were three reasons that NATO was formed 75 years ago last Thursday. Number one, many of the countries in Europe had gone through two devastating world wars where literally millions of their their fellow men and women were killed. And so they wanted to form a collective security organization to protect themselves so that wouldn't happen again. The first article addresses that. It says that this organization is developed to ensure that disagreements are handled in a peaceful manner. So that was one reason the history of World War I and World War II very much on their minds and trying to ensure that we didn't go through that again. The second reason was the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, after World War II, was very aggressive in moving across Eastern Europe. In 1948, they marched into Czechoslovakia and took that big chunk of real estate. They were occupying East Germany, and the United States felt that we needed to be part of an organization that would deter Soviet aggression. And then the last reason, which has to do with North Atlantic, is the fact that the vast majority of trade in the world in those days, and even today, travel by ocean between the United States and Europe, back and forth. And that's the North Atlantic piece. And for both world wars, German submarines, battleships came down from the north of the North Atlantic and did a lot of damage to the trade around that organization. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had in mind establishing what naval people understand as a GI-UK gap. Greenland, Iceland, UK transit that would allow the United States to monitor and block naval forces coming down to threaten traffic and trade in the North Atlantic region. And I'll show you maps here in a minute to better do that. So these were the countries that were the original members in 1949, 12 of them. Primarily what we know of is the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. They had really suffered huge losses in both world wars, and they started a collective defense called the Western Union in 1947. That grew into what became, in April of 1949, the original North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And again, these are the countries that were involved. Looking at the map, this is the gap that I'm talking about, the GI-UK gap that allowed NATO to defend against enemy forces coming down, enemy ships, submarines coming down, and interdicting trade and traffic. So this was a very important part of the thinking as they developed the North Atlantic Treaty. I think you also, looking at this map from the top of the world, you see the size of what was then the Soviet Union is now Russia, 11 time zones. It is a huge country. And I'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but the Soviet Union, or Russia today, comprises 54% of the boundary of the Arctic Ocean. So the Arctic Ocean and the Arctic will be very important to the world's security in years to come. And as I said, Russia has the majority of the land adjacent to that part of the world. Okay, during the Cold War, Greece and Turkey were the first countries that became members of NATO in 1952. Interesting, because Greece and Turkey had fought each other for 2,000 years. There are still islands in the Aegean today that they argue about as to who owns those islands. So the fact that they came together into this collective security organization was extremely important. Not only did it give NATO that boundary within the Mediterranean, but it also brought two old enemies together so that indeed they could work together to solve their differences in a peaceful manner. West Germany became a member in 1955. As you recall, West Germany was occupied by Allied forces until 1954. And there was a great deal of dissension about whether Germany should be rearmed and become a member of NATO. That was a big topic and a big issue to overcome. We did agree. They did become members. And as you know, when they unified with East Germany in 1990, we now have the Federal Republic of Germany that is a member of NATO. And then last, Spain became a member in 1982. You recall Spain was governed by Franco and his administration until 1975. And then from 1975 until probably 1985, they went through a number of internal civil war kind of adventures, determining whether they were going to be communist or not, or socialist or not, or what Spain was going to be. In 1982, they became members. Sort of a turbulent decade, perhaps. But today, I would tell you, Spain is one of the most faithful, loyal, contributing members of NATO that we have. So we're glad to have Spain as part of the organization. And this is the organization that lasted through what we know of as the Cold War in Europe. And we talk about France. France was in and out and in of NATO. To begin with, as I told you earlier, they were one of the original signatories. And NATO was located in Paris. Dwight David Eisenhower was the first commander of NATO, and his headquarters was in downtown Paris. But France, being France, wasn't real sure it liked this cooperative defense arrangement and wanted to be independent and speak for itself. Most importantly, the decisions having to do with nuclear weapons caused France to leave the military part of NATO in the mid-60s. France has nuclear weapons. All the other members of NATO who have nuclear weapons have committed their weapons to work together to defend the NATO countries. France never has agreed to do that. They said that they will use their weapons, their nuclear-powered submarines in defense only of France. And so even though they came back and rejoined NATO in 1995, they did not join the nuclear planning group portion of NATO. And today, even, they will not contribute their nuclear weapons to the deterrence efforts in NATO. So Russia was not asleep. Soviet Union, as it was called then. When West Germany was admitted to NATO, Russia formed what we know of as the Warsaw Pact. And then this is what it looked like throughout the 50s and late 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s up until 1990. You had Europe divided into the Warsaw Pact countries and NATO. And then you had several countries that were called non-aligned, to include Sweden and Finland up here. But I point out too these Eastern European countries here maintain their national sovereignty, but they were parts of the Warsaw Pact. The countries that we concern ourselves with today, Ukraine, Moldova, the Baltic nations, they were part of what was called the USSR, or the Soviet Republic. And that's what President Putin has said publicly, is that he wants to restore that republic. So those countries that are in this region here who are now independent, and many of them are part of NATO, is the objective of Putin to bring them back under Russian control. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. He has publicly declared that. The nation has publicly declared that as a goal, and we don't want to lose sight of that. So this is what we know of as the Cold War. We, the United States, had 400,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in Europe during this period. So many of your friends and neighbors contributed to what we know of as the Cold War and the victory of the Cold War in Europe. And I would say that NATO was largely responsible for that victory. In 1990, the Soviet Union fell. The Warsaw Pact fell apart, and these countries began to join or want to join NATO. Some of them wanted to join because they wanted to be part of this collective security organization. Some of them wanted to join because they wanted to be part of the European Union, which is a commercial organization in Europe. And the only way they could become part of the European Union was to be approved by NATO. So they had financial means or incentives behind them. I don't see anything wrong with that. They have become very, very faithful members of NATO today. But all the way from the first one is the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary in 1999 through Sweden, which is the latest, that brings the NATO membership to 32 countries in Europe from the original 12. This is a busy slide, but shows by year how NATO has expanded eastward. Also, I use this to make the point, part of the Russian dialogue today is that President H.W. Bush and his administration had promised Gorbachev, when the Soviet Union fell, that NATO would not expand eastward. Now, that's what they say. We have not disputed that. It is not in writing, and we obviously have expanded eastward. But that's part of the Russian dialogue today, is that we promised we would not do that, and we did. Again, back to the Arctic Ocean and the fact that Russia occupies 54% of the perimeter of the Arctic Ocean. And now that the Arctic Ocean is the ability to sail that ocean much of the year, it has diminished the utility of the GI-UK gap issue that I talked about earlier. And my belief is that the Arctic Ocean will be an area that you and I or our children will concern themselves with in terms of security for years to come. The other nations are all members of NATO. And right now, it's not a NATO-Russia confrontation. The laws in the Arctic Ocean are governed by the United Nations and what's called the law of the sea, International Law of the Sea, which is also a treaty which the United States failed to join us, and we in North Korea, the only two nations in the world that failed to join the international law of the sea. But that is the method of governing issues in the Arctic Ocean and deciding who does what to who. You may remember about a decade ago, Russia planted a flag right here in the North Pole, claiming half of the Arctic Sea being part of their international waters. The organizational structure is fairly simple. There are political, civilian leadership. The North Atlantic Council meets at least once a week. Heads of nation meet twice a year. You see this on television when you see all the presidents of the nations come together. They're the ones who form the overall decisions having to do with what NATO does or accomplishes or doesn't accomplish. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly, you don't hear as much about that in news, but it's very active. Members of our Congress and the legislatures of other members get together and discuss important national security issues from time to time. And then the NATO headquarters moved from Paris to Brussels, and it's located in downtown Brussels today. The military part is headed by the Military Committee, which is comprised of all the chiefs of defense, our Secretary of Defense, and the chiefs of defense of the other nations in the world that are part of NATO. And they meet periodically to take the guidance that they get from the NATO Council, the civilian leadership, and implement it into military operations. And then the Allied Command, the head of that has always been an American Supreme Allied Commander, NATO. The head of the civilian portion has always been a European, and that's the Secretary General of NATO. So that's the organization and how it operates. And if you have questions, I can go in more detail about that. Two articles, one you've heard about and the other one you haven't, but I want to talk about those. These are articles of the treaty. This one says, basically, if a country feels threatened, they can call together the leaders of the other countries and come up with a resolution. We don't hear a lot about this, but it's been invoked 7 times. 4 times by Turkey, and then recently 3 times by nations around Ukraine. NATO is a consensus organization. Whatever, and that makes it hard because it's very bureaucratic, but whatever actions it takes must be approved by all 36 nations. Imagine that. We can't even figure out the menu of the Pines by consensus. So think about trying to put together a military action with 36 nations agreeing and concurring. But that's the rules. So Article 4 says, when you feel threatened, you can call together and we'll come up with a solution. So this is imposed, as I said, 4 times. Turkey has done 7 times. Turkey has done it 4 times, threatened by the conflict in Serbia. A Turkish jet was shot down several years ago, and also by a terrorist organization called the PKK that operates in the eastern part of Turkey. And so with those 2 threats, they invoked Article 4. Leaders met and they provided support in terms of both troops and aircraft and early warning systems that are in place today to help shore up the border of Turkey with Serbia. And then the other one came when Russia invaded the Ukraine. The Baltic nations, Romania and Poland and Hungary all invoked Article 4. They came together and NATO agreed, and we now have 85,000 soldiers stationed in those countries, providing additional support, plus aircraft that was sent to Romania and Hungary that are supporting deterrence in Eastern Europe. So that's Article 4. You don't hear a lot about that in the newspaper, but it's very important. And then the one that you do hear is Article 5. And this is the one that says any of these 36 nations that are attacked, it is assumed to be an attack on all, and all will respond. This is the heart of the collective security. Any attack on any member of NATO requires all members of NATO to respond. This has only been invoked one time, and that's after 9/11. It was invoked by the United States, and NATO came to our support with both air and sea forces to help in our response to 9/11. From 1950 to 1990, NATO did not operate outside of the boundaries of NATO. It was focused on the Cold War, on Cold Gap, and preventing the Russians from coming in and taking over portions of Europe. And so while the membership was fairly steady, its focus was clearly defensive in nature, but it was very, very involved in nuclear planning. Almost every country in Europe had nuclear weapons positioned as part of the nuclear defense of NATO. It was a very, very difficult time. We have all lived through that and are grateful we don't have that today. But nuclear weapons and the nuclear defense of Europe was extremely important. And then, as I said earlier, in this period, we had 400,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines stationed in Europe. Today, we've got about 50,000. So it is a more peaceful world, and we're grateful for that. And I think NATO is largely responsible. These operations are what was called out-of-area operations. When the Soviet Union fell, there was a big debate on, okay, what is the purpose of NATO? And NATO began to operate primarily as an arm of the United Nations to police and carry out United Nations decisions regarding these conflicts. The only one that was not was Libya in 2011. That was not a United Nations operation. Caused a great deal of dissension between members of NATO. We sort of got involved, did a few things, and then got out and left it in a big mess, which is still a big mess today. So, but Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Syria, those things that you're aware of, NATO was very much a part of. So these are the issues I think that we see in the news today and that we're concerned about. One is the top one, collective security versus isolationism. This is the only organization in the world that builds itself around this collective security idea, principally around that Article 5 that we just talked about, that an attack on one is an attack on us all. There are lots of treaties between nations, but there's only one collective security organization, and that's NATO. It's been operating for 75 years. I think we're a safer world because of it, but I think there's a fair argument that says we can't police the entire world. We can't afford to go and get involved in every single conflict that comes about in the United States today. So that is a fair argument, and like most arguments, there's no black and white. There's a lot of issues in between. isolationism. We felt like years ago that we had two giant oceans and we could defend ourselves and we didn't have to worry about anybody else. Obviously, that's disappeared now. But isolationism, or a degree of isolationism, has been discussed in our political arenas forever. Wilson had very, very deep difficulties with the Congress on getting involved in World War I. Our nation had difficulties in World War II. It was only when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor that we officially got involved. So historically, the United States, I think, has been an isolationist nation at heart. And can we do that today in the 21st century? Are we better off as part of a collective security organization, or are we better off as part of going our own and isolating ourselves? And my belief is that there's no right answer on either end. Somewhere in the middle lies the truth. I don't want my son fighting for the freedom of some of these countries in Europe, but he might be. And that's part of the collective security that we've agreed on. So that's the price of being a member of NATO. I'll talk a little bit more about the upcoming membership questions. But after the Soviet Union fell and all those countries in the early 90s wanted to join NATO, we created what's called the Membership Action Plan. And it's a plan that's, for our government, is overseen both by the State Department and the DoD. The State Department looks at governance of a country. Are they corrupt? Are they not corrupt? Are they democratic in nature? How can they fit into the organization of other nations? And then the military looks at the military capabilities, both what does this country provide for the overall enhancement of NATO, and in many cases, as importantly, how difficult would it be to defend that nation if we had to defend it? So the Membership Action Plan is a plan that oversees it. There's one country, Bosnia-Herzegovina, that's been approved, and probably in July, when NATO heads meet in Washington, Bosnia will be invited to join as a 33rd member of NATO. And then the other members that are officially asked to be members of NATO are Ukraine and the Republic of Georgia. And I'll talk about those in a little bit. And then now I want to talk about dues, because this is the one that headlines the news day in and day out. And so this is one I want to get to the fact basis. The operational expenses of NATO. Every country pays their expenses for their forces that are part of NATO. So when NATO sends 100,000 troops to Afghanistan, and 10,000 of those come from Moldova, or not Moldova, they're not part of NATO, but from Hungary, then Hungary pays their salaries, their food, their weapon systems, the operational expenses. And then also the operational expenses of the NATO headquarters in Brussels is divvied up among all the nations. That's not an issue. The operational expenses are paid for by everybody, and it's considered to be fair and equal. What is an issue is the 2% goal for defense. And this came about after the war in Bosnia, or Kosovo rather, in the late 1990s. We went to war in Kosovo to implement a UN resolution, and many of the countries in NATO could not participate because their weapon systems could not interact with our weapon systems, most especially air. Um, they had not, many of the countries had not invested in secure communications. And so their planes would arrive on station and want to drop bombs in Kosovo, but they couldn't talk to the people on the ground because they did not have secure communications. So that was a major event in the life of NATO. Out of that, NATO created what is called NATO Transformation, which is located in Norfolk, Virginia today, whose sole purpose is ensuring that the military equipment of the different nations can talk to and operate together, which is very important. But also out of that came a goal of spending 2% of your GDP for defense. And that's been a goal since 1990. It's not 2% for NATO, it's 2% for your national defense. And we've called on each nation to have in their budget 2% for defense of their nation, which buys equipment, pays for soldiers, moves them around, all those kind of things. As of today, and throughout the time frame we're talking about since 1990s, very few countries have met that goal. Today, only 11 of 31 or 32 meet that goal. They have agreed that by the end of 2024, they will all meet that goal. I doubt it. One of those who's been very guilty, if you will, is the Federal Republic of Germany. Germany felt after the wall fell and they needed to unite their country, that they had a lot to spend on making East Germany and West Germany one country, and they shouldn't have to spend very much money on their national defense. They are the largest economy in Europe and spend about 1.6 of their GDP on defense. Their chancellor, as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, has promised that by the end of this year, they will meet the 2% goal. So Germany is moving up into this. You see the countries that haven't met it now, well, that have Poland on the border of the Ukraine is the highest at 3.9% of its GDP. United States is second. And when I say second, that's not 3.4% for NATO. That's 3.4% of our GDP for our global military expenditures, national security expenditures. Now, in truth, Poland's budget is about $36 billion a year. Ours is $832 billion. So what we, the United States, spend on our national defense is more than twice all the members of NATO combined. These are the countries that have not met the goal. I'm not worried about Luxembourg, but I am worried about Canada and Turkey. All agree, as I said, to meet this goal by 2024. I have grave doubts that will happen. Okay, before I go to questions, I'm gonna show you a few maps and then I'll come back and we'll do questions. This is Finland. The border with Russia is 923 miles. That's a huge, long border that used to be something that Russia didn't have to worry about. Now they do have to worry about it because Finland is a member of NATO and we're right there on that border of Russia. Very important. This is the Ukraine, and down here is Crimea, and I'm sorry that I cut it off. I couldn't figure out how to get it all on the country, on the map. Right now, Soviets occupy Crimea and most of this area on this side of the border. Ukraine has asked to join NATO officially. Years ago, they had a huge governmental problem with corruption. They have worked steadily to improve that. I think their governmental issues are about solved now. In July, NATO has promised to not admit Ukraine, but tell Ukraine exactly what has to be done in order to qualify them for admittance into NATO. So can you do it while they're at war? That's a big question. But that's an issue that we will be facing, and you will see a lot about that in July at the NATO meeting here. This is a country called Moldova. They have not applied for membership, but they are on the verge. Along the border with Ukraine is an area called Transnistria. It is the leading smuggler of small arms around the world. They're full of Russians, oligarchs who make a lot of money by doing illegal things. And when Russia was attacking, they wanted to take Odessa and then link up and claim this part of Moldova. They were not successful in crossing the river here, and so Odessa still remains in the hands of Ukraine. But Moldova is very concerned about its security, and you will hear about Moldova in the news in the days to come. Russia invaded the Republic of Georgia in 2008. And the Republic of Georgia made official application to join NATO. And at that time, President Obama was our president, and he said that Georgia is not ready. And it's been sort of tabled like that since 2008. Russia has two areas, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that are Russian-controlled areas inside their country today and have been for years. It is a very beautiful country, great people, but whether or not they will ever be part of NATO, I don't know. But it's a decision that will have to be made. And once again, when their freedom is threatened by Russia, you'll hear more about it. And then what I think is the area requiring the most diligence on the part of NATO is the Baltic area. As I said earlier, all of these countries were part of the USSR initially. Going from East Germany, Poland, and the Baltic nations were all members of the Warsaw Pact. Sweden and Finland were neutral, and the Baltic Sea was pretty much a Soviet sea. As you know, many of you have been there, St. Petersburg is here, which is probably the second most important city in Russia. They owned all of this. Now NATO owns all of this. There's one little area called Kaliningrad right here that is part of Russia. And they have two entrances into this. There's a train that comes through Lithuania and Belarus to Kaliningrad. And then there's a two-lane highway that trucks use to resupply it. This is the home port of the Russian Baltic Fleet. It was and probably still is the home of a lot of nuclear weapons and very important. In my belief, if I were Putin, I'd want better assurance that this was part safe and take care of it. And so I think we're going to see Russia moving in that direction if they're successful in the Ukraine. Okay,
So
I finished exactly on time.
Let's give this man a big round of applause. Carlton, I see lots of newcomers here, so I want to remind people, on this side will be Carolyn Ortmeyer with a mic. I'll be over here. You raise your hand, please speak into the mic. He'll repeat the question and then answer it. Let's get started.
Remember, if they're political in nature, you're saving those for Irving.
If I understood you correctly, you said there were two countries who did not join in protecting the Arctic, and one was the United States and one was North Korea. What is that all about?
Go to Google and look under the International Law of the Sea, which was a treaty from the United Nations that governed the international waterway to include the Arctic. The United States refused to ratify that treaty in 1998, I think. Still has not ratified it, and neither has North Korea. As a result, we don't get to vote on policies having to do with the Arctic because we're not members of that treaty. So we operate through Canada, which fortunately we've got that kind of support. But this is one of those self-inflicted wounds that we did to ourselves.
If it's a possibility that the United States would pull out of NATO, if this happens, will NATO collapse and will be an open door for Putin to just go west?
To begin with, to pull out of NATO,
Would you repeat the question?
I'm sorry, the question was, if the United States pulls out of NATO, will it collapse? And what will happen with Putin? We see today an increased activity in Europeans to come up with assurances that they can continue to defend themselves if the United States leaves. Very nascent and not very strong and promising. We need to be there, in my view. Number two, I would remind you that it is a law. It is a treaty. The president cannot unilaterally withdraw from NATO. And just last year, the US Congress passed another law that said the president of the United States cannot unilaterally withdraw from NATO without congressional support. Now, if we had a new president and he had congressional support and they voted to come out of NATO, it could happen. And that's why we see NATO doing things, at least in the talkative stage, about how they would handle their defense without the United States leadership.
It would seem to me that the one thing to draw all these nations together would be a common language. How could military organizations cooperate in a positive way without having a common language? What is that situation within NATO?
It's a good point, and the question was common language. How can 36 countries operate effectively together without a common language? All business is transacted either in English or French. That was agreed upon initially, and then having worked in many of these countries, I never had a problem with language. Everybody that I dealt with spoke enough English, and I'm not very smart, so I couldn't speak their language. But everybody that I dealt with had enough English to effectively cooperate. So I don't see the language. At the small unit level, it may be an enhancement, but it's not a detriment to operating together, I don't think. That's not that we shouldn't all go out and learn additional languages.
I noticed that you mentioned that Bosnia is in line to become a member. But I noticed that Ireland and Austria in particular, not yet. Now, I don't know whether they apply for it or whether NATO has to ask them to come aboard.
Austria and Switzerland, along with Finland and Sweden, have a long history of being what they call non-aligned. And remain, Austria and Switzerland remain that way today. Sweden and Finland, as you know, just joined, but those countries, and there's no effort that I know of to change that. One question back here in the rear. Carolyn, that's a long hike.
Thank you, Carlton. That's a very interesting program. I have two questions, if you don't mind. They're rather short, I guess. One is Turkey's position in NATO seems to be connected off and on with Russia. You know, with the political situation, maybe it's not worth really addressing. And then secondly is that you've addressed the Arctic Circle, and I know that Norway has great defenses up there that they're very concerned about. Can you discuss either one or both of these?
Question is about Turkey and Norway in the Arctic Circle. First, Turkey. I love Turkey and I love the Turkish people. I spent a lot of time there. They're great. They're great allies. They appear to be against almost everything that comes up, not quite like the French, but almost. If you look behind the scenes, their actions are usually transactional in nature. We have a pending sale of some kind of aircraft or some kind of air defense system or something like that. And so when an issue comes up, they'll oppose the issue until we agree to sell them F-16s or whatever we're going to sell them, and then they support the issue. Now, the latest has to do with, I don't know how to turn my watch off. The latest has to do with admitting Sweden into NATO, which they were opposed to. And the reason why is because Sweden was a sanctuary for many of the Kurdish separatist movements that created the turmoil in Eastern Turkey for many years. PKK especially, which is even we classify as a terrorist organization. Many of them found home in Sweden, and Sweden gave them sanctuary. And so that was the issue over Sweden's interest as to would they stop doing that, and they agreed to. By and large, Turkey always comes through once we give them what they want. Norway is very concerned. As you know, Norway abuts the Soviet Union right up at their major, the Soviet Union's major naval headquarters in the Arctic. And Norway was occupied by Germany in World War II. Very, very difficult time for them. They have harsh memories. And as because of that, they're extremely concerned about their borders and protection of their nation. They have in the northern part of Norway, they have caves that is just filled with military equipment, both US and other NATO countries, that they pay for the storage and the maintenance and the care of. We go in there and exercise every couple of years to see if we can do what we need to do. But Norway is very concerned and spends a lot of time and effort ensuring that they're ready to defend their borders if they have to. As far as the Arctic is concerned, they are a very vibrant leader of this coalition that establishes the rules and regulations the international sea in the Arctic. And aside from Canada, we obviously depend on them a great deal. As we do, remember Greenland is a part of Denmark. So Denmark is a country that controls this massive land of Greenland. And Denmark is a representative that oversees the Arctic Ocean from that perspective. Yes, sir.
Thank you for this very informative information. Excuse me, does this work? Let's go back to history just a little bit. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, when expansion toward the east occurred, there was enormous debate about that, as you know. George Kennan was against it. A resident of the Pines, who had a long diplomatic career, was against it. I'm curious from you, because you were on the inside, did you see that expansion as a push from the United States in the West, or as a pull from those Eastern countries that very much wanted to be protected from Russian aggression?
That's a good question. The question has to do with the expansion of NATO eastward. And do I see that as a push from the United States and NATO to push eastward, or is it a pull from those countries that want to be part of this organization? Most important thing that occurred early on, in my view, was the agreement, what you all may remember called the Nunn-Lugar law treaty, which said that the Soviets would move all their nuclear weapons east of the Urals, and the United States and other nations would reduce their nuclear weapons in Europe. That lowered the temperature significantly. And historically, I think one of the bigger decisions of our world. Many of these countries, and I had the opportunity to go and evaluate some of them, many of these countries were not involved not interested in joining NATO. They wanted to be part of the European Union for commercial, for jobs, for those kind of things. But NATO was a step they had to go through to get there. Bulgaria is the one that sticks out most in my mind. I don't know if you've ever been to Bulgaria, but they have an interesting war museum. They've been at war with somebody forever. And the very first exhibit of the war in Bulgaria is in the 1st century. So you go through 24 centuries of wars. But Bulgaria was not interested in being part of NATO. They were interested in being part of the United Nations, of the European Union, and felt that that this was a step they had to go through to be part of the European Union. That was the case with a lot of the countries in Eastern Europe. Other countries like Poland, like Lithuania, sincerely wanted to be part of the Western military organization. And so from their perspective, it was a pull. So I think there was a little bit of both. But my evaluation, in most cases, it was a pull because these countries had been part of the Soviet Union. They didn't want to do that again. And they felt that NATO was the collective security that could ensure their peace and freedom.
Well, we're at the point of
One more question.
Well, there was a question.
Oh,
before- there were
okay.
a Bunch of questions back there. So what I'm going to suggest,
I'll
because I
be-
know some people need to go, is that we pull this together and express gratitude for this wonderful talk. Let's do that. And then I'd like you to know that our talk this coming Monday will be Robert Lutz, Dr. Robert Lutz, who is the sports medicine doctor for the college And I know he treats many people in this room, even though you're not athletes. Furthermore, he is an expert on PSTD, this distress syndrome. And he's been here with the dogs that he trains to help people. So he should be a very interesting presenter. So he'll stay here a little while, right? For people who have some questions and want to come up and shake his hand. Thank you all.
Thank you.